Media's still here.
Girls stick together.
Can't back you on this one, Ernie.
Exactly.
All right, how do I get this presentation up there?
Mm.
Now you need help.
There we go.
Lindy, can you help him get that?
All right, good afternoon, President Ovalle and members of the board. I'm here to present the FY2020 proposed capital plan for your consideration. As you know, our capital plan funds long-term investments in our school facilities, including repairs, upgrades, and any investments associated with academic priorities. Our capital plan, as Heather mentioned before, is funded primarily through bonds issued by the district, but also includes any external identified funding. This year's proposed capital plan includes close to 400 projects at over 300 schools all across the city. In prior years, our market access was really tight due to the fiscal challenges we had, and it was really hard to plan from a capital perspective on a year-to-year basis. As Heather mentioned earlier, given the improvement of our fiscal situation, we're not only able to propose a strong capital plan this year, but we also have relative confidence in being able to propose a capital plan in subsequent years of an equivalent amount, which will give us the ability to actually have a long-term capital planning strategy that we haven't had in a number of years. Our proposed capital plan for FY 2020 includes potential funding from the state of Illinois of nearly $200 million, thanks to the $45 billion 6-year capital plan that was passed during the most recent legislative session. This is the first capital plan by the state in 10 years. And while we don't have clarity yet on when the funding will be available, we are including the appropriation in our plan to ensure that we have the necessary authority as funding becomes available by the state. I'll go into more detail in subsequent slides on the different areas, but I did want to highlight overall some key initiatives that are included in this proposed plan: the high school science labs, IT modernization, full-day pre-K expansion, ADA accessibility, and investments to support the schools that are going through a change in academic process as part of the academic RFP earlier this year. Overall, CPS's 3 major capital areas are in 3 buckets. First, deferred maintenance. Secondly, investments related to academic priorities. And then third, new construction to alleviate overcrowding. While the district is not proposing any new construction to address this issue in this capital plan, we have invested significant funds in prior years, specifically in FY17 and FY19, for new schools, annexes, and additions. It's important to note that the average age of a CPS facility is 79 years, and we have over $3.4 billion of deferred need, of which $1.8 billion of that is considered critical in nature. And breaking that down, around 90% of that need is concentrated in roofs and mechanical systems, but it also includes fire alarms, security systems, ADA, and turf fields and playgrounds. It's also important to note that the needs that we have as a school district are all across the city and are not merely concentrated in certain communities. And while we do feel strongly that this proposed plan starts to address many of the critical issues across the district, the biggest issue that we face is that we just have more need than resources to address. But as I previously mentioned, the improvement of our fiscal situation does provide us with a better idea of what a 5-year capital plan will look like and what that market access should be. So it will allow our team the ability to actually do long-term planning. When developing our list of projects for the proposed plan, we start with a 3-step process. First, we evaluate the assessed conditions at each one of our school facilities. Secondly, we work to prioritize projects based on the highest level of need and those that present the greatest immediate health and life safety concerns. We then develop scopes to align with these projects. Once we have that prioritization list, we then apply a number of additional filters to ensure that we finalize our proposed plan. First, we look to see if there's a program change at the school so we can address both deferred maintenance as well as investments associated with academic priorities. Second, we also make sure that the proposed investments are tied back to the priorities that we laid out in the Educational Facility Master Plan, or EFMP, that we issued last year. In prior years, and Board Member Trust knows this very well, we were criticized for proposing capital plans that didn't align to the EFMP that we released prior to those plans being announced. Given that we did publish a comprehensive EFMP last October, we were able to ensure that every project that is in our proposed capital plan is directly in line with the priorities that was in the EFMP. We also worked really closely with the Office of Equity to ensure that we were applying the appropriate lens to this work so that the end result would lead to a much more equitable distribution of projects across the city. When I get to the different bucket areas, I'll let you know specifically the partnership with both the Office of Equity as well as other departments in regards to that lens. These steps, along with the filters, then led us to the list of projects which are in our proposed capital plan. This next slide shows an overview of the three different capital buckets that I previously mentioned: deferred maintenance, academic programs, and enrollment, along with the different strategies, considerations, and information used to develop the list of projects in the proposed plan. This lists the EFMP, the ARA, our assessment information, all information that helps us to identify where the need is and how to prioritize across different areas. This slide shows how our proposed capital plan is scheduled to be financed. As mentioned earlier, the majority of this plan will be funded by bonds issued by the district. Also includes the nearly $200 million from the state, $50 million in federal E-rate funding, $15.5 million in local external funding that has already been identified. This includes TIF money, aldermanic menu money. And as we do in every plan, we put a placeholder for other potential external funding that may materialize during the year, which include additional TIF and menu money, as well as other grants and funds raised by school communities. Similar to the allocation for the state, having this placeholder allows us to have the necessary authority to begin projects as that money materializes during the course of the year. So we get even more granular in nature into our different buckets. Our capital plan is broken down into 6 areas: $263 million in facility needs, nearly $17.5 million in interior improvements, $180 million in programmatic investments, close to $87.5 million in IT and security investments, nearly $45 million in site improvements, and $26 million in capital support services. You also see the additional money from the state and external funding noted below. As Heather mentioned during her presentation, over 93% of our proposed plan will support schools that serve majority low-income populations, which we're obviously proud of. But once again, we know that there's certainly more work to be done in subsequent years to ensure that we strengthen our work around equity. As we look into the details of each bucket, you'll see that we're proposing $133 million in priority envelope projects, $30 million in mechanical systems, and $50 million in emergency repairs, which is significant as we didn't have the luxury of having a contingency to address projects that, during the course of the year needed to be addressed. We also have $50 million to address a number of key areas, including fire alarms and chimneys, as well as $10.5 million in ADA accessibility. It's important to note that while any major capital project contains significant ADA upgrades, the district is going to set aside funds in addition to that for the first time in over a decade to support additional ADA accessibility across the district. As part of Dr. Jackson's 5-year vision, we set out a goal to ensure that every school in the district has a minimal first floor accessibility. While we obviously strive to greatly exceed the goal, we know that this is an important first step to tackle this issue. In the next bucket, we are proposing nearly $17.5 million in interior improvements, which vary in scope from the restoration of gyms and auditoriums, renovation of bathrooms, lunchrooms, and other classrooms that are in dire need of investment. The $180 million in programmatic investments are broken down into 3 major areas. First, the $120 million to support the full-day pre-K expansion for school years 1920 and 2021. Secondly, the $30 million for the second year of a 3-year initiative to ensure that every district-run high school in the city of Chicago has a state-of-the-art high school science lab. We prioritize neighborhood high schools, especially those in the south and west sides, during the first 2 phases of this plan, and we'll continue on with the remaining of our schools in year 3. Lastly, we have set aside $30 million for the 32 schools that are receiving a change in academic focus as part of last year's academic RFP. This includes a build-out of STEM labs, art rooms, dance spaces, and other investments to support the new academic specialties that these schools are offering. And as I mentioned earlier, we also have the opportunity to tackle some deferred maintenance associated with those schools as well. In the next bucket, you'll see close to $87.5 million in IT and security investments. The lion's share of this funding will be used for the second year of a 4-year initiative to ensure that every district-run school has a 1-to-1 device-to-student ratio, as well as the necessary infrastructure and bandwidth to support these devices. In these first 2 years, our IT team has prioritized those schools with the largest digital divide, which not surprisingly also aligns with communities with high concentrations of low-income and high minority students. It's important to note as we take a look to answer your earlier question, Board Member Rome, if we take a look at the different buckets here and kind of the approach that we took to each. On the IT piece, as I just noted, the 75 of the $87.5 million is going towards IT modernization. And what the IT team did is make sure they had an understanding of where are schools that don't have devices, where are schools that don't have infrastructure. Along those lines, they worked with the Office of Equity to make sure that we take into account factors such as the economic hardship level, geographic and demographic distribution, and just making sure that the investments that we have in these areas are serving those school communities with the greatest needs. So kind of working our way up from the bottom to have a kind of an explanation of the steps that we took around the lens of equity. For the full day pre-K expansion, as most of you know, this was a multi-year planning process with the key rollouts being in areas of the highest needs. So this is year 2 of this process. And last year and this year, we are serving those areas of the city with the greatest need. And the capital investments both last year as well as the $120 million align with the prioritization from the work with the Office of Early Childhood Education. So we take a look at the $30 million in programmatic investments to support those schools that had to change in academic focus. Once again, that was a nearly year-long process of using ARA data to really identify the gaps of program densities, especially in those areas of need. And these capital investments support those schools that were selected as part of that process. Same with the high school science labs. One of the directives from Dr. Jackson and Latanya last year was if we're going to roll out a 3-year initiative to ensure that we have high school science labs in every school, start with neighborhood schools. And last year, every single project that we prioritized was a neighborhood high school, primarily in the south and west sides, areas of the city that have not seen a lot of investment. We finished the remainder of the neighborhood schools in this year's plan, and next year is the proposed capital plan. The remaining schools in our portfolio will receive those investments. When we take a look at the facility needs, and I'm going to talk a little bit about site improvements moving forward. One of the both unfortunate aspects, but also gives us the ability to have a much greater prioritization around equity is the need that's out there, right? As I mentioned, we have around $1.8 billion of critical need. And while the plans, both on the roofs, mechanicals, and when we get to the site improvements, there are always going to be a number of schools that the life safety issues are so great that we need to address them immediately. So they're always going to be at the top of any of our lists. Sadly, when you kind of get past those issues, a lot of schools, the situations, their roofs, their mechanicals, their playgrounds are all in similar rough shape. And in working with the Office of Equity, working with our educational side, it's what are the areas of the city historically and certainly over the last few years that we haven't made significant investments in? So for example, Earl Elementary came in and thanked us for work. That was something in partnership with the Office of Equity. We knew that was an area that hadn't had significant investment. Melody on the west side, received both the roof and a mechanical system. That was a school that hadn't seen significant investment. And one thing, and I know Lucino's going to probably ask about this, is when we have situations where both a roof and a mechanical system are in bad shape, we like to bundle them. It's much easier and much cheaper for us to go in and fix a mechanical system at the same time that we're fixing a roof. One of the things that we try to do is if we're going to touch a school, we're going to finish a school. So a school like Melody, a school like Earl, a school like Morgan Park, those schools received a significant amount of capital, but we wanted to make sure if we were going to go into that school building, we maximize the dollars that we were able to dedicate to those projects. The final investment area, as I touched upon, is for site improvements, which includes $45 million to repair, replace, and build new playgrounds and turf fields. This includes our continued partnership with the Healthy Schools campaign, the Water Reclamation District, the Department of Water and Management around the Space to Grow program. And we also set aside funding to start taking down modulars that have not only exceeded their useful life, but are also no longer needed by school communities. We started to tackle this last year in the community of Pilsen. They had an annex that was no longer needed. we tore it down and put a brand new turf field and playground there. So we have set aside money to start prioritizing those projects. The last bucket of funding on this slide is for the management of our capital program, and includes program management, design fees, assessments, and other costs associated with the development of these plans. The last slide on this presentation highlights the investments across the city by planning area as included in our annual regional analysis, and is broken down by those budget categories listed in our EFMP. So if you look back at the 300-page document from our EFMP, you'll see these budget categories by planning area, and each of these investments that are proposed in this capital plan align directly to those priorities listed out. In closing, while we're proud of the proposed plan that we're bringing to you today for your consideration, we also know that we need to continue to refine our work, especially finding additional ways to make this process even more transparent to stakeholders. Maurice and his team were great partners in this work, and being able to start even earlier now that they're fully staffed and operational for next year's capital plan will lead to an even stronger result. So this is a nice way to start, but we know that we can continue to do even better. With that, I welcome any questions or comments, and just remember to dictate any questions to Lindy.
Questions? I thought you were going to say Matt.
No.
Okay.
So I have a couple of questions. First of all, you've answered one, so that's good.
Yep.
And we should, once we go into facility, just look at our needs. That being said, thank you for making the statement that we have about 3.4 billion in need out there, 1.8 billion in critical needs. So clearly, we're not funding all the critical needs given the budget that we have. So there's still a lot more to fund. The transparency of the process of which ones get funded and not needs to continue. So I applaud the process there was taken to date. And also, as we look at those, ensuring, I'll cite one example that we heard from today, right? So the speakers that we have from Kellogg School did an excellent job of putting together a PowerPoint, all of pictures depicting the needs. And I can't gauge what, how many of those are critical versus not. But there are probably 400 other schools in similar situations, right? So I also want to make sure that we don't overreact and ensure that we do take a step back in equity and look at all schools equally, right, across all districts, because they're not all here giving us their presentations with pictures. So that part of the process needs to continue, focusing clearly on the critical needs. Do we have a sense, given that we heard on another issue related to capital needs is ADA access, right? Do we have a sense of, similar to how you sized the 3.4 billion in deferred needs, if money wasn't an issue, what would it take to make all floors accessible?
Sure. So ultimately, our assessments have to ensure first floor accessibility to every school, around $80 million, and to make every school ADA accessible from top to bottom, around $600 million. Once again, it's important to note that of the 263 in facility needs that we're going to do, as well as some of the programmatic investments, those areas will allow us to chip away at that ADA accessibility. And that's why, even though we have a 5-year goal to ensure minimum accessibility, meaning at minimal hitting that $80 million target, we feel both with the opportunities that we have in other capital areas, but also with a 5-year capital plan. And as investments like the pre-K, projects, go by the course, we will have the ability to invest more in deferred maintenance and ADA accessibility over the next few years.
And how many of our schools are already fully ADA accessible? Do we have?
We can
Okay.
get that answer, but yes.
Can I just ask a related question on the
Yeah.
ADA, because this came up today, but also at the Capitol hearings last week. I can imagine there could be different ways to approach it. So one is making the first floor accessible. Another could be making a smaller number of schools fully accessible, or targeting investments based on where we have students with demonstrated need, or communities that have, I guess, a greater or lesser need. How was the decision made, or can you explain a bit about the logic of making the goal first floor accessibility?
So I think there's a couple of pieces to it. I think one, we need to start somewhere, just kind of like, level setting. I think two, while there's not only issues in regards to student accessibility, we want to make sure that parents, community members can have access to the school. And if you're at least assuring first floor accessibility, you can then make accommodations to have report card meetings, things of that nature. With that being said, I think it's important to note that we have not allocated that $10.5 million yet to projects.
Okay.
We want to work with stakeholders. I mean, Access Living is someone who's been deeply involved in CPS. They're an organization that, we read their report. They're an organization that we're going to reach out to as we kind of go through the strategy. We're going to work also very closely with the Mayor's Office for Peoples with Disabilities, Commissioner Tamley. But we have specifically not allocated that $10.5 million because we want to make sure we have the right stakeholders at the table to make those decisions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. President. Yeah, Ernie, could you, well, first, let me just say thank you in a sense because, following this process for a while, and thank you, Dr. Jackson, in terms of the alignment, the budget with the vision and the financial stability that goes along with it. Just want to commend you all and staff at CPS on that. And, but could you also talk about, the next steps in terms of the assessment of the school buildings?
And that's actually a good point because I did want to follow up with that relative to a question that Lucino had is, we are required by state law to do biannual assessments of all of our facilities. And up until 2015, the way the district did that was best practice. You contract out with a third-party company that does a comprehensive assessment of all your facilities. In 2017, our capital plan was, I think, roughly $106 million. Those assessments cost around $5 million. And the decision was made that we would do those assessments internally. There was a lot of criticism. I could also understand not wanting to devote $5 million out of a $100 million plan. In last year's capital plan, we did put together an RFP as well as funding to include assessments in there. It's a $5 million line item, which the process is ongoing. But as part of that RFP requirement, not only will the company have to put a school by school comprehensive 70-page assessment as on our website, but they also have to be able to aggregate information in a much more public-facing way. So to answer, Board Member Sotelo's question, when you have a situation where a school says, why did that school get, a new roof and I didn't? While we would never print a list of 1 to 500 just because conditions change during the course of the year that require a school to go up or down, when an assessment is done, there is a prioritization of certain tiers.
Sure.
So one of the things that we want to be able to do as part of our long-term capital planning, when these assessments are done, and they should be done by next year, is being able to have public information that shows where tiers are. So as we tackle a 5-year capital plan, we should be able to sit there and say, you know what, we want to try to get to all the roofs in tiers 1 and 2 across the next 5 years. I'm making that up, but it will provide a much greater level of visibility to people and saying, well, I'm in tier 3. I guess my roof is not as bad as anyone else, as other folks. And it's not to say that they don't have an issue, but at least they'll have an understanding of where they stand relative to the prioritization of that.
Yeah, and lastly, the board member, Reverend Lurie, pointed out that it's a pretty good idea. Was thinking of stealing it from him, but yeah. but just trying to create a process where that the budgeting process can be participatory.
Yep.
That people can, in addition to the assessments, because they're there every day, that that they can also be able to weigh in. During the budget process for both capital and operating. Well, operating is kind of with the RFP. That's a cool deal. But yeah, just create that opportunity, for schools and parents and stakeholders to be able to, participate that way.
Yeah. And, one thing, when we released our initial EFMP in 2013, we created a number of community hearings specifically around the EFMP, and we got criticism saying, hey, we already have standing CAC meetings and other community-based organization meetings that CPS can leverage. So that's what we did last year. And then we got criticism saying that's great, but you need to find a balance to be able to make sure that you're using existing vehicles for community engagement, but also carving out opportunities to specifically talk about capital and
all
facility planning as a whole.
All communities, they don't have a CAC, for instance, or so it's just that to be fair from north to south to make sure that the education stakeholders, as well as those parents and family, have an opportunity to participate in the process, and that it's something that we, advertise and let them know that, hey, we like to get an idea of what's going on in your school and making sure that you're not being left out.
Absolutely.
sort of building on that a bit in terms of the transparency side of things. Well, first, just to go back a moment, I just want to also say thank you for the focus on deferred maintenance this year. I mean, I think for so many years, you see over and over these new projects, and some of them, we looked at the heat map that was shown where they've been located.
Sure.
And so I think it's a big deal to actually address the deferred maintenance, a lot of investments at neighborhood schools in this capital plan. But similar to Board Member Trust, I think the need for transparency also needs to be around the equity analysis. So it's one thing to say a hardship index is used, and I know that the Office of Equity is working at putting together some more processes and tools, but I think the more that we can, when they exist, share them
Absolutely.
with the public, have either a participatory process or whatever this engagement is going to look like around both the capital plan and the budget plan, that brings that level of analysis and allows people to actually engage in it.
I
is,
completely agree.
yeah, important.
I'm good. I'm just feeding a fed horse at this point because the points have already been lifted up around the transparency, and you gave some nice examples, Arnie, too, of like the level of transparency that you want to be able to provide. And I think also just underscoring the participation.
Absolutely.
Okay, if there are no other questions or comments regarding the capital budget, we can proceed.
Thank you, Arnie.
Thanks, Arnie.